receiver downfield, and there was good coverage on the receiver.
3rd and 1 or 2. Here's a handoff, and what a defensive play. That play is going to wind up short. Who was it? That was Borland that dove headlong over the Fairmont offensive line to make the tackle. Chris Borland with a diving tackle. He just hurdled the line headlong over his own defensive line and then over the fair.
Chris Borland was one of the NFL's most promising rookies last season, but on Monday, Borland announced his retirement from the San Francisco 49ers over concerns about the long-term effects of head trauma. He is just 24 years old, but says the risk of playing are not worth the rewards.
If you watch Chris Borland's highlights going all the way back to high school, you get a different interpretation of how he earned his moniker. But football's most dangerous man didn't get that label on the field. He got the label when he walked off the field at 24. Only 5 years earlier, he was pulling out all the stops, passing out highlight tapes, attending camps. He did what he had to do to extend his football career. When he got his scholarship, he rushed and hugged his coach, then celebrated in the parking lot with a standing backflip. 5 years later, he was drafted into his dream job, where he looked like a star who was destined for greatness. Chris recorded over 100 tackles as a rookie. This was despite only starting 8 games. Then a few months after that, he unstrapped his shoulder pads, hung them up in his locker, and never played again. The NFL and others feared this would bring a dark topic to light. Media speculated that more and more players might follow. Or if Chris wrote a book and maybe down-talk the league, there was a chance he'd turn a significant amount of the public against football. They thought this man alone could bring down this massive industry, and no one man should have all that power. But power is not inherently good or bad. It all comes down to the wielder of the power. Does he allow it to corrupt him, or does he use it for good? Cue the Wayne.
Yeah, you'll never know quitter, 'cause I'ma go get her.
Alright, real quick before we jump in, today's video is sponsored by SeatGeek. With over 28 million downloads, SeatGeek is the #1 rated ticketing app. There's more than 70,000 events every day on SeatGeek. Concerts, festivals, and more. Or maybe you want to show the kids a good time. Take them to check out a Hot Wheels Monster Truck show. But with the NBA and MLB seasons in full swing and the NFL approaching, you're not going to want to miss out. Now, SeatGeek always wants to make sure you're getting a good deal, so when you're on the app, remember, green dots mean good deal, red dots mean bad. Every ticket is backed by their buyer guarantee, and SeatGeek is the only site that lets you return your tickets ahead of the event with swaps. And you know I came through, so use my code FlemLo for $20 off your first purchase at SeatGeek. That's $20 off the first tickets you purchase on SeatGeek using promo code FlemLo. So make sure you click the link down in the description and download the app and check out an event. Thanks to SeatGeek once again for sponsoring the video. Without further ado, it's time to jump in. So Chris grew up in a middle-class suburb in Dayton, Ohio, in a home spacious enough for him and his 6 siblings. His large family of 6 boys and 1 girl are very different from most families because their political views run a full spectrum. So routinely they argue about politics, which is interesting. And while I have zero interest in what their politics are, I bring this up because it shows that he comes from a family of independent thinkers, and they were clearly trained to do so. He also comes from a background where these NFL millions weren't seen as a salvation for his entire family. Even as a kid, Chris was made aware of the potential dangers of football, as he wasn't allowed to play the sport until he turned 14. Prior to that, he played a physical brand of basketball and soccer, and his dad knew that once he got on the football field, he'd fall in love. He played running back initially and was happy to find out that running through a defender in this sport was not a foul. It was not only allowed but actually encouraged, and while he was quiet off the field, the contact was right up his alley. Now Chris's dad played linebacker at Miami of Ohio, but it wasn't until his senior season when Chris moved to defense. This play was 3rd and short, and he goes full Palomalu as he makes a stop every linebacker dreams of one day making. Having a late start, all Chris could think was that he wanted to play this game for as long as possible, meaning he didn't want his career to just end after high school. Like his dad predicted, he fell in love with the game. But college programs didn't fall in love with Chris. They said he was too short and too slow and he didn't get any offers. So one of his many older brothers just took it upon himself to help get Chris up to the next level of play. So he Googled Brian Urlacher's workout regimen and created a stripped down version that Chris could follow. Then he drove Chris to football camps, handed out highlight tapes, and Chris worked as hard as he could so his brother's work wouldn't be in vain. Once Chris's makeshift agent got people to take a look, Chris wasn't a hard prospect to sell to college coaches. Maybe he wasn't the fastest and maybe he wasn't the tallest, but if you watched his tape, it was clear. He was a dog. As a senior, he recorded 72 tackles on defense. On offense, he rushed for 1,200 yards and 19 touchdowns. And he didn't just play on two sides of the ball. The highlight tape even included Chris kicking. In track and field, he did the shot put, and he ran 100 meters. But despite all of that, he was still just a two-star prospect. It probably felt bad at the time, but I'd argue this was good for him. As an athlete, it helps when you can come through some type of adversity. Chris had decided that he wanted to play at Wisconsin, the same school his granddad had attended back in the day. His brother takes him to a camp, they pass out the tape. It was essentially the same routine they'd always done, only this time, it actually worked. So the Wisconsin coach was impressed, and following the camp, he invited Chris to his office and immediately offered him a scholarship. Chris was so happy that he jumped out his seat and rushed towards the coach and actually kind of scared the man a little bit. Was he going in for the kill? Like the play on 3rd and short? Man, no. He closed the distance and went in for a big hug. Then the standing backflip he hit in the parking lot after shows a couple things. One being his excitement to play the game. The other thing it shows is his crazy athleticism. He may not have been the fastest, but a linebacker hitting the standing backflip is pretty damn impressive. At that time, Chris would describe football as something he loved. But looking back, he described his affinity for the game kind of different. He grew to kind of look at it as more of an addiction. And I kind of think I know what he means when he says that. I guess anytime you love something that you also consider bad for you, something you feel you should walk away from but you can't put it down, for him I guess it will fall under the category of addiction. Today, Chris describes the game as a crazy rush, a high almost unlike anything else he's experienced, even saying that for him, football and sex fall into their own categories of catharsis. But back when he got his scholarship, his mindset was different. And it's interesting to see how it evolved over time. During his freshman year in college, he was top 5 on the team in total tackles despite only starting 6 games. He finished 3rd on the team with 10.5 tackles for loss, and he finished with more sacks than his future All-Pro teammate. But as impressive as that is, this next part is jaw-dropping, as the freshman linebacker also played part-time kick return. Bro, what? He returned 7 kicks for a total of 106 yards, so an average of 15 a pop. He also returned 1 punt and took it 25 yards, and even kicked some extra points during games that were out of hand. He was voted to the freshman All-American team, but then missed the next year with a season-ending shoulder injury. In 2011, he returned as a redshirt sophomore, and over the next 3 years became a perennial first-team All-American. He was one of those linebackers that was always around the ball, seemingly in on every single play. At that time, you'd never guess that he'd soon walk away from the game. You telling me this man was afraid to tackle people? But Chris Borland, when he played, seemed to play without fear. He was a fierce competitor and not the type you want to run into in the hole. In each of his final 3 college seasons, he went over 100 tackles. And not no soft tackles, he broke the Big Ten record for forced fumbles. Some linebackers make a lot of plays in college almost solely due to their speed and athletic ability. When they get to the NFL, they can't make reads or shed blocks. And the only time you see him in the backfield is if they have a predetermined blitz. And while Chris wasn't the fastest, he knew how to play the game. His ability to anticipate made him dangerous before the moniker. The physicality was there as he played with reckless abandon, all while maintaining what I consider good tackling form. In college, he learned to study film more efficiently as well, which only added to his apparent psychic powers. His time spent on offense of course played a role, as things he saw other teams do on offense looked familiar to him. During his best statistical season in 2011 as a sophomore, dude managed to record 19 tackles for loss. Man, the next highest total on the team was his close friend and fellow linebacker Mike Taylor with 9. He left the school with a bang, winning Big Ten Linebacker of the Year and Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year during his senior season. And dude was so cold that when he left the school, even when he left the game, Wisconsin didn't forget him. He made the all-decade team. At the combine, he measured in at 5'11", 250. He had a 37-inch vertical, which explains the standing backflip. 29 reps on bench to go with a 36 on the Wonderlic. He was strong, he was smart, but he was slow. His 40 time wasn't amazing. He recorded a 4.8, but his tape was good enough to still get him selected 3rd round. In 2014, San Fran had one of the best, if not the best, linebacking core in the entire NFL. Problem was, both Patrick Willis and Navarro Bowman struggled with chronic injuries that would plague their careers. So they drafted Chris Borland, in part for some insurance. And usually when you buy insurance, there's a waiting period before you can use it. Luckily for the 49ers, in football, it's not the case, as Chris was ready to go before they ever actually needed him. But Navarro Bowman tore his ACL in the NFC Championship in 2013, the year before Chris was drafted. And Bowman ended up missing all of Chris's rookie season. But the Niners had enough depth that Chris still didn't start. Then, only midway through the 2014 season, San Fran's all-pro linebacker Patrick Willis surprised everybody. Due to chronic injuries, he was stepping away from the game, despite many people believing he was still in his prime. That surprise act plunged Chris into the starting role, and in his very first start, he had 8 tackles and a sack. The very next week, bro, in only his second start, he recorded the most tackles by any player that season. 18 tackles with 15 solo. It was clear the 49ers had a new star at linebacker. The next week he did it again, 17 tackles this time, and he continued to put up Pro Bowl type numbers every week. He only started 8 games, but here's how he finished the season. 107 tackles, 84 solo, 1 sack, 2 picks, 5 pass breakups, 1 forced fumble, and 11 tackles for loss. After that, Chris was quickly tagged as the next great 49ers linebacker. Or at least that's what everybody thought, as nobody imagined they lose 3 great linebackers all in the same calendar year. During his days at Wisconsin, things might have seemed rosy, but behind the scenes, Chris had started to question a lot of things. This was laid out in a 2015 ESPN magazine article written by the Finaro brothers. During his freshman year at Wisconsin, Chris served as a wedge buster on the kickoff team. He compared the job to, quote, bowling, but it's people doing it. In his very first collegiate game, Chris blocked a punt that was recovered by his team and run back for a touchdown. Unfortunately for Chris, he couldn't remember any of it. Earlier in that game, he'd busted a wedge on kickoff, and after that collision, he just couldn't remember the rest of the game. That night, his head pounded so bad he couldn't eat, and he was afraid to fall asleep, scared he might not wake up. So he arranged for a teammate to call him every couple hours. That way, if he didn't answer, the teammate would know to get Chris medical help. Keep in mind, Chris at this time was like 19 years old. And looking back on this moment, he regrets the way he handled it. But he never said a word about the incident to his coaches, and days later, he stood proudly, as he was rewarded with Special Teams Player of the Week for a play he couldn't remember. It was only a few months later when he was introduced to Toradol, a controversial painkiller used by football leagues. At certain points, he used it as often as every other game. He was concerned with his health then, but he was more concerned with some of his teammates. In the article, he tells a story about one of his close friends, who I already introduced to you earlier in the video. I said Mike Taylor was second on the team in tackles for loss, but what I didn't tell you was that he actually led the team in total tackles. Mike and Chris made for an amazing linebacking core, 2 guys who on Saturdays laid it all on the line. At one point, both men thought they'd be doing this for the next 15 years. Ironically, each only played 1 season in the league. And with stories like the one I'm about to tell you, you kind of start to see why. In 2011, Chris Borland wasn't the only Wisconsin linebacker who was putting up crazy numbers and on an absolute tear. One of his best friends, Mike Taylor, stayed stride for stride with Chris. He even had 22 tackles in a game versus Ohio State. A couple weeks after Ohio State in a game versus Minnesota, Mike Taylor tore his meniscus and should have missed the rest of the year. Well, the Monday after the game, dude rushed to have surgery. They removed half his knee, and sewed him back up. And this is crazy, but by the end of that week, he was back on the field. He took a bunch of Toradol and he wrapped the knee with bandages, went out on the field and somehow had 13 tackles. At halftime, he thinks he took another shot and finished the game. Mike and Chris were both sharp guys. They often joked about how crazy it was to play with these injuries, but at the time they continued. Now you kind of start to see why Mike calls it an addiction, but they both maintain that they're the only ones to blame. They both say they made the decisions and will live with the results. And because they're not throwing blame, it makes them seem more genuine. They aren't guys trying to tear down the sport that we love. They're two dudes who've been through a lot, sharing their own personal experience. Chris is described by former teammates as extremely conscientious. All of his coaches, friends, and family seem to echo the same sentiment. Hell, a writer from the Wisconsin State Journal called Dude the most thoughtful athlete he'd interviewed in 40 years. Point is, he never did anything without thoroughly thinking it through. And he's always been seen as a fair and logical person. He'd been thoroughly thinking about potential long-term effects that this sport that he loved could have on his body. During his first year of college football, he'd suffered a bad concussion. His first year in the league, and history would repeat. Before he took over for All-Pro Patrick Willis, before he racked up 100+ tackles as a rookie, before he had an 18, a 17, a 16, a 14, and a 13 tackle game with 2 picks. Before all of that, believe it or not, dude was already considering retirement. Crazy. During his first training camp, Chris took on a lead blocker on what was by all accounts just a routine play. That lead blocker just so happened to be fullback Will Tukafu, a 6'4", 290-pound man. Chris Borland, ever the studious and prepared linebacker, Chris looked to occupy the fullback in hopes of freeing up a teammate, likely the system Chris and his boy Mike used at Wisconsin. But in college they didn't face a lot of guys like this, but Chris ran right into him and he made a nice stud. On contact, he buried his head right into Will's chin, but afterwards he walked away, dazed and confused. Reminded him of that feeling of being dog-ass tired, but sitting up in bed trying to fight off your sleep because you're afraid if you doze off, you might not wake up. See, Chris knew that this particular night would be the same, and he wondered to himself, how long do I want to do this? And even if I do continue, what will be the lasting effects? And in that moment, his mind became fixated on that question. He buried himself in research, hoping that what he found could give him the reassurance that he could play this game safely. But that ship sailed quickly when he got his hands on a book called League of Denial, published in 2013. That book was actually written by the Fenaru brothers, the same authors who wrote the ESPN The Magazine article I've referenced. Of course they mentioned that in the article, but ironically enough, my first time coming across that information was in a different article. It was mentioned on a site called On Wisconsin, in an article called Hard Truth by Preston Smith. In this one, man, they told a story that I can easily visualize as a movie or something, so I'll tell the first part in my words and I hope they connect. Chris really sat in an NFL locker room while reading a book that seems to condemn the NFL itself. As he read the book, he felt increasingly isolated. He even hid it within another book's cover to conceal what he was reading. He sat there expressionless, nothing to see here, but in his head things were moving at 1,000,000 miles per hour. Here's a short excerpt from this On Wisconsin article. It includes a couple quotes, so I'll just read this short section. Chris Borland learned to compartmentalize. I was living a binary life, out of necessity, he says. During practice, games, and training, his focus was remarkably singular, but in the back of his mind, he was thinking of his long-term brain health. Borland wrote a letter to his parents, and he handed it to him after a preseason game. It outlined his concerns, and it even suggested that ultimately, he might not be long for football. Earlier in the summer, he jotted down his career goals, which included playing for at least 10 years. So here you can see how suddenly things changed for Chris. But the truth is, the accumulation of his experiences in college, mixed with his upbringing which trained him to think independently, that set off what I would call a chain of events that ultimately led him to this exact point. Chris linked up with researchers turning over every stone trying to figure out a way that he could make the game safer. His conclusion by the end of it was that the sport couldn't exist without the inherent violence and therefore couldn't be made safe. So after that one season, and months of research, he contacted the 49ers and informed them he was retiring. Beforehand, he'd asked one of the researchers he'd spoken with if he thought people would make a big deal about him retiring. The researcher, probably not having gained much headway, told him, nah, you'll probably be on the ticker at the bottom of the screen. But when word got out that this 24-year-old prime athlete who was a borderline Pro Bowler was walking away from the fame and walking away from the money due to concerns of head injuries, the football world panicked.
NFL star Chris Borland was known as a fearless player, but after one season he quit because he was afraid of head injuries.
Many people from within the sport were bombarded with questions. Was this the beginning of the end for American football? Was Chris walking away an indictment of the game? Would high school football teams get shut down across the country? What would Chris say in interviews? Was he trying to sell a book? How much would he reveal? People feared he'd single-handedly just tear down the sport. But one thing I really respect about Chris is that he was very intentional to not just come out and condemn the game outright. You can even see it in some of the interviews. They're trying to pull it out. They want the dirt. They want the anger. They want him to point the finger. But he always seemed to speak of it as just a personal decision. And he doesn't try to push his ideology on others. He still has many friends who play the game, and he doesn't want to rain on their parades or ruin something they love. Like, for what? He decided he personally didn't want to play. He stated his reasons and walked away. And that was all there was to it. But while Chris was ready to walk away and put football behind him, the rest of the world just couldn't let it go. The isolation Chris felt when he was sitting in the locker room, unexpectedly for Chris, followed him into retirement. With so many friends being former teammates or coaches, Chris was being constantly reminded of his decision, and friends that he'd known and he'd loved for many years were so awkward around him he felt he had to console them. Other former teammates labeled him as the soft guy, which isn't fair, but if you still play, you might need to take that stance. Chris probably understood that you gotta be in the right mind frame. So if you're gonna still play, you gotta send your brain the right messaging. These guys are today's gladiators, and there's risks that come with that. And of course, there's also rewards there to help offset the risk. But if you have a person who weighs the risk reward and decides it's not worth it, like, how could you blame him? I don't know what became of Chris and Mike Taylor's relationship, but since Mike only played 1 year and was on practice squad another, before basically being forced to retire due to injury. Even though I don't know them, bro, I hope they're still cool because they've been through so much together and they have so much in common. And Chris doesn't say it, but you kind of get the feeling that Mike was that person he called to wake him up every 2 hours. Chris once loved the game with everything he had, and he admits that love will never fully go away. A linebacker being called the most dangerous man in football in many cases will most likely be seen as a compliment. But for Chris, the game changed as he grew, and it happens. We grow in different directions, and we gotta be true to that. If Chris was power hungry, he could have easily reveled in this new power that he wielded, and many companies lined up trying to be his sidekick to take on the NFL, who some see as a villain. Chris got call after call of companies wanting him to stand next to an assortment of projects to condemn the NFL. Chris considered every single offer he got seriously, but to 95% of them, he still said no. The only ones he said yes to were the things that truly aligned 100% with his beliefs and convictions, such as Tackle Can Wait, a youth football program that promotes flag football only up to the age of 14. It's called Tackle Can Wait, not Tackle Should Never Happen. He's just saying he believes kids should wait until high school to play full contact. As you recall from earlier in the story, that's what he ended up doing as well, as his dad also believed the kids should wait until high school. So he always found things that aligned with his values, but also wouldn't disrupt anything the NFL had going on. But despite his best efforts, he was cast in a role as the anti-NFL guy, which was a role he never wanted. But if there ever was a time where he wanted some get back, it would have been during these last couple situations we'll discuss in this video. After retirement, he had to pay back $463,000 of his $600,000 signing bonus. The NFL also sent him a mandatory drug test after he'd announced his retirement from the game. Chris wondered if it was a setup. Why send a drug test now? Were they trying to find a way to assassinate his character? According to one article, the league sends these two retired players so they can't just unretire once the drugs are out of their system. But any of us in Chris's shoes would have definitely been suspicious. He took the test but also got a private test done as well. That way, just in case they did try to set him up, he knew he would have evidence that no drugs of any kind had contributed to his decision. He was in a clear state of mind. Today, Chris seems to be looking for the intersection between the game of football and mental health. He's doing things he feels is worthwhile and will help people. He focuses on positivity, not lobbing grenades at the league. He co-founded a company called Bias Media, which of course is a cool spin on the word bias. I was surprised to see their mission is really similar to my own, telling sports stories to shed light or teach lessons. And while trust me, it don't pay nothing like an NFL salary, in my biased opinion, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. But at the end of the day, a guy deemed the most dangerous man in football isn't at all looking to damage the sport. He's one of the few people in today's world who has used his power to actually help people and not just attack. And that's rare in these times. If you just look around the landscape, every good cause get hijacked and turned into a weapon. Before long, that weapon's not aiming to do good. It gets to the point where it's only used to destroy other movements. And it does that all while giving little to no help to the actual groups they claim to represent. Usually when people are looking to destroy an entity, whoever's at the top of that movement really has ulterior motives. Some crave revenge while some just want power, and they take advantage of people who just want something to believe in. But by focusing on himself and offering info, not advice, Chris, in my opinion, has kind of found that sweet spot. There's an old idea that something like a knife can be dangerous, or it can be used to make food safer for a small child. The question is, what will you decide to do with your knife? Will you sneak around and twist it in someone's back when they're not looking, or make the world more consumable and easier to digest?